We have this morning a couple of stories from early in Jesus' ministry that were defining moments for him. Defining moments for who he was as a person, who he was as a leader, and defining moments about the faith to which he committed his life. He pretty much epitomized the kind of person that was talked about in the second reading, I think. And that was actually used as an advertisement some years ago for Apple computers when they were beginning to do things that all their competitors weren't doing. And both these texts, I think, have some things to teach us about what it means to be people of faith and really what it means to live a good life. And so as we get ready to explore them a little bit further, seeking some inspiration that might fit for us here and now, would you pray with me? Spirit of inspiration beyond containing, be with us in these moments of reflection. Speak to our hearts a word that challenges and uplifts us so that we can come away from this time of encounter with you, this time of worship, more prepared for the day and the week ahead. We are grateful, O God, for your faithfulness, and we ask that you would continue to help shape us into the people we most want to be, your people. And now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing and acceptable in your sight, you, our strength and our liberation. Amen. Amen. So the Gospel of Mark is the earliest gospel that was written, and one of the distinctive things about Mark's gospel is that it jumps right into the heart of Jesus' ministry. There are no birth narratives in Mark. There's no preface, really. It just begins there in the wilderness with the adult Jesus being baptized by John, and then things get rolling very quickly. The stories in today's reading are still very early on, as I mentioned, in Jesus' ministry. People are still trying to learn what he was all about. And what we know so far is that he's a bit of a troublemaker, at least in the opinion of the religious leaders of his day. They don't like the people Jesus hangs with, right? He's unashamedly sits and eats with so-called sinners and tax collectors and the like. They don't like the behavior of his disciples. They judge it as being unworthy of so-called holy people. And here in this passage, they do not like the fact that in their minds, Jesus breaks the commandment or the law not to do work on the Sabbath. Now, to be fair, this was a big one. You remember that this made it into the top 10, right? The commandment says, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to God. You shall not do any work. But as we see in this text, Jesus doesn't see things quite the way the religious authorities do when they claim that he's broken the commandment. These religious authorities, in fact, illustrate for us very well what happens when it goes wrong, when people become so obsessed with the letter of the law that they forget to remember and honor the spirit that inspired it. The commandment to honor the Sabbath wasn't a bad commandment. It was a good one, really. It makes a lot of sense, even still, for us to have a day set aside for rest. A day to stop the rat race for just a while and claim for ourselves some breathing room. It's a good thing to have a Sabbath, to stop from our busyness and just remember to appreciate and notice the incredible and varied blessings of our lives. It's a good thing, the Sabbath. It's a good thing to find some balance in our lives so that we don't become so driven by ambition or achievement that we forget what a gift it is to simply be alive and in relationship with a God who loves us. Keeping the Sabbath holy is a great rule as rules go. However, when adherence to that rule becomes legalistic and more energy and effort go into pedantically policing the behaviors of others than goes into actually honoring the Sabbath, then something's gone awry. So what if the disciples picked a bit of grain as they walked through the fields? They were hungry, and it nourished their bodies and sustained their lives. So what if Jesus showed compassion to someone on the Sabbath and restored someone's hand? It was the right thing to do. Was it work? Maybe. Maybe it was. But what honors God and the Sabbath more? Adherence to legalism that would actually do harm to one's body or make one miss the opportunity to give compassionate service to someone in need? Or, as Jesus clearly demonstrates, is it to use one's better judgment, to move beyond a strict and limited application of the rule book for the greater good? When Jesus saw that they were ready to criticize and accuse him for doing something good on the Sabbath, he basically said to them, "Are you serious, people? Really? What do you think is more lawful, to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath? And use your brain for a minute here. What do you think pleases God more? To save life on the Sabbath or to destroy it?" This was not religious rocket science, right? The answer's pretty clear. It's pretty simple that laws are fine and good when they guide us in ways that help us live out our highest values. But when they actually become so rigid and confining that they keep us from doing those things, from living our faith and honoring God, then that's not right. In fact, that kind of religiosity made Jesus really mad. This is actually the only passage in Scripture that describes Jesus being angry. Now, of course, we see angry behavior at other times, right, when he turns over tables and drives out money changers, but this is the only text that describes his emotion, his feeling, as one of anger. And it's the healthy kind of anger, right? We might call it righteous indignation. He was angry at their hardness of heart. Because when it all boils down to it, and Jesus said this again and again, the point of life and faith is to love, to be compassionate. Love God, love your neighbor, he said. On this hang all the law and the prophets. All that other stuff is meant to help us do that thing well, loving. And when the rule book that is designed to help guide us and show us how to love comes up short, or if we apply those laws in ways that take the loving right out of it, then it's time to move beyond the rule book. You've had experiences with this kind of thing, I'm sure. You've heard religious people talking about love and then behaving in a way completely different. You've probably observed churchy people or churchy institutions becoming so fixated on narrowly applied laws that they no longer resemble a faith that's meant to inspire us to acts of love and compassion. It's ugly business, isn't it? Jesus thought so. And the really good news for us is that he modeled for us an active, healthy resistance to that kind of religion. He showed us how to be rule breakers at those times and in those places when we know, somewhere between our head and our heart, in our spirit, when we know that that rule is either inapplicable or in need of some pretty drastic revision. Jesus lived and encouraged others to live a liberative faith that relied more on an active living engagement with God, the eternal Spirit, than on blind obedience to a set of inflexible rules. I remember one of the first times that I struggled with this concept. I was quite young. My family, well, some of them, went to the Church of Christ, and my mom had been my Sunday school teacher from the time I was 2 years old. She was good at it, very creative, dedicated. She spent lots and lots of time trying to figure out ways to explain some pretty hefty principles of faith in ways that made sense to young children. And she definitely had the gift of crafty. She could do amazing things with glue and paint and macaroni. You know the type. Unfortunately, when she divorced my father, the church leaders told her that she could no longer teach Sunday school because the rules were very clear that divorced women weren't fit to teach anyone. Now, these church leaders that shared this information were the very same church leaders who counseled my mother to leave my father because he was abusive. And divorcing him was maybe the one way that she could save her own life and those of her children. So, in a way, they went beyond the rule book in one instance by encouraging her to do something they actually believed was wrong because it would save a life and because it was the right thing to do in that situation. But then in the next breath, they got all tangled up in their own rules and they lost a really good Sunday school teacher. And in fact, they lost a church member altogether. My mom's never been back to church. And that's a shame. And even at 6 years old, I knew that was wrong. I knew that that was not the kind of faith that interested me. I found it repellent. I began to get words to describe how repellent it was only later in life, but I knew it wasn't for me. But you know, the faith of Jesus that's modeled in this text and in countless others, that's the kind of faith that does interest me. In fact, I find it compelling. The faith of Jesus presents a radical approach on life. And it's an approach that requires more of us, I'll be honest. Because we have to take responsibility for thinking, imagine, and for feeling, and for sometimes struggling to make the best decisions we can when things are complicated, which is most of the time. It's sometimes, or at least we think it is, easier to give up that responsibility, to sort of just learn the rules and follow them. But that is not ultimately very satisfying. It's not nearly as meaningful. It's not as relevant because, let's face it, the rules will fail us. It's much more difficult to have to exercise our own moral discernment, to really be in active relationship with the Spirit of God in such a way that every day we seek wisdom and do our best to put it into application in the complex realities of our lives. But you know, I think that's what faith is all about. Loving takes work. It's hard. It is at once simple, which is not to be confused with easy, and very, very complicated. As the world changes, as we ourselves change, we have to find new ways of putting love into action. We have to engage our brains and our hearts. And we have to learn to trust ourselves a little bit, that sometimes we really do know what's right, what's loving. We are honoring parents today at General Shepherd MCC. This is a day kind of in between the observances of Mother's Day and Father's Day. And so we're celebrating all parents today. And I want to say that I think parents know a thing or two about this. Most of the people I know who parent will acknowledge that once they are entrusted with this new life, this miraculous creature, all the rules go out the window. No child comes into this world exactly as expected. And they are unpredictable little things. Unfortunately, they never grow out of that, no matter how old they get. Absolute rules about what to do and not do don't really take into account the uniqueness of an individual and their context. Parents have a really difficult job. I think it's probably the most difficult job there is, and I know I'm not qualified for it. Parents know that rules are important and necessary. They spend a lot of time teaching and reinforcing healthy boundaries about what's acceptable and what isn't. But parents also know, this is a both-and kind of thing, that rules on their own are insufficient. They have to inspire a kind of critical judgment in their child so that they can learn to make good decisions in a complicated world. They have to give them something more than pat answers to life's deepest questions, because the truth is that both the questions and the answers will change over time. And they'll come against things they were never prepared for. And so parents have to teach them to be attentive and ready to use their minds, ready to follow the truth in their own hearts, ready to be alive on an unpredictable planet, in relationship with a God that will never leave them alone, even when they might think they are. Parents have to learn to trust their children also, whether they like it or not, because they're individuals who have their own mistakes to make, their own futures to explore, their own lives to live. It requires active engagement and grace. Now, I suspect that parenting, much of the time, is frightening. Am I right about that? Terrifying, the job of parenting, I would imagine. But I also know from listening to parents and from watching them that parenting is a source of deep and abiding joy. That, you know, parents and children will make mistakes and they will disappoint one another. That's the inevitable nature of things. But when they have cultivated relationships of love, then those relationships are resilient enough to make it through those times and come out stronger. Faith is like this, inasmuch as it is more than can be chiseled into some stone tablets and preserved for all time. In fact, faith is not meant to be concretized and contained, but rather to be lived expansively. This is what Jesus showed us how to do and called us to do, to be people of living faith in the world, active, nimble, adaptive, engaged in relationship with a God on whom we can depend, and, if I dare say, using the brains and hearts God gave us to navigate finding ways to be loving and living and liberating in the world. So my prayer for us today is simple. I hope that we will answer this challenge, accept it repeatedly, and go boldly forward as people ready to live and love and parent beyond the rule book in all the ways that increase our capacity for compassion and love. We can be the kind of people who change the world. We can. And if we turn a head or two in the process because our loving or our living is unconventional, oh well, good for us, we're in good company. Jesus did as well. The point is that we take the risk to have an engaged faith, one about which we can honestly say, I am 100% all in. That is the kind of faith we need. That's the kind of faith the world needs, because it's relevant, it matters. And so I think let's insist upon it. I can't think of a better way to make holy this Sabbath day than to do that. So may we so. Amen.